The boys always go fishing with first-timers. And they don't quit till they reel someone in.
God, I don't belong here.
We have a winner!
I want to go home.
Where's fish? Where's fish? Where's fish?
I don't belong here. I want to go home. I want my mother.
Welcome. This is the Dr. Junkie Show, and I'm Ben Boyce, formerly incarcerated person, prison educator, and author of The Spectacle of Punishment, Lessons from a Century of Prison Films. That's what today's episode is about, this book. So let's start at the beginning. Actually, let me briefly remind everybody what comes before the beginning of this book. I'm a doctor of communication, and that means no matter what story I'm telling, or no matter what class I'm teaching, I'm always coming at it from the perspective of communication, how messages move about the world and teach people things, often without us even realizing it. Now, we all live in a media-fueled era. The majority of our messages come from various forms of media. We're actually 100 years into this massive boom that started around the turn of the century. And we've had a lot of really poignant moments historically in that first century, from the 1900s to the 2000s. Perhaps most notably, what happened in Nazi Germany. A lot of that was the result of clever utilization of media spectacles. And it fueled what became known as the Frankfurt School of Communication, which paved the way with early work about how television and media impacts the beliefs of those who consume it. So that's what this book and most of my work, this podcast, the classes I teach, the articles I write, that's what they're based on. So now let's start at the beginning of the book. Outlaw stories are fun. We love them. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Bonnie and Clyde, Tupac Shakur, Donald Trump. America holds an odd fascination for people who refuse to follow the rules and who wind up in legal trouble because of it. I imagine that speaks to some of our deepest cultural schisms, the things we both embrace and reject at the same time, like violence, wealth accumulation, power grabs, putting ourselves and our families ahead of others, religious principles. But as decades have passed, and books have become high-definition films and television shows about outlaws and prisons, the stories we tell about lawbreakers have remained incredibly stable. They are, in many ways, the same stories, renamed and repackaged to appear new over and over, despite following the same tired scripts as always. As I'll argue in this episode, and as I argue in the book, prison cinema is all now largely the same. Don't believe me? Let's jump in. If you want to talk about outlaw stories in the United States, you're going to find right away that they all have two main characters: an outlaw seeking redemption and a lawman who won't let him have it. This is Andy Dufresne pitted against the warden of Shawshank, or Clint Eastwood pitted against the warden of Alcatraz in the film by the same name, Alcatraz. It's Michael Scofield from Prison Break against the warden and his dirty guards. It's the bad guys in Oz against the administrators. It's Cool Hand Luke against the warden, Derek Vineyard in American History X versus the entire prison structure, Miklo in Blood In, Blood Out against Detective Paco, his ex-friend. Every outlaw story centers on the tension between an outlaw seeking redemption and a lawman who refuses to allow that to happen. Now, of course, all outlaw films don't look the same. They appear to be different in lots of ways. Some take place almost entirely inside a prison, like Shawshank and Prison Break. Others take place largely outside prison, like Carl Upchurch's gang redemption story, Conviction. And others, like Les Miserables, pick up steam after the outlaw escapes prison, so we hardly see outlaws incarcerated at all. But always there's a past of incarceration that hunts down the outlaw and refuses to release its grip upon him. This is a clip of Conviction where Carl Upchurch has been released and placed at a home on the countryside to serve out his parole. Upchurch is a black man, and the home he's placed at is in the middle of nowhere on a farm surrounded by white people. This scene begins as a cop car pulls up.
Hey, Jim.
Morning, Martha.
Is everything all right?
Yeah, just passing by. Everybody okay here?
Yeah, Oh, great. Carl Upchurch, I'd like you to meet Sheriff Stark.
Morning, Sheriff.
Upchurch, yeah. I heard about you.
You related to the boys? Which boys?
Carl's helping out on the farm.
Well, that's nice.
Would you like a cup of coffee, Sheriff?
No, thank you. Do you make that? Is that what you do here, Carl? You cook?
And you pick the cotton. Arthur, have you seen his record?
Do you know how many calls we've gotten since he got here? We have had 2 calls from his parole officer. We got another call from Philadelphia PD, for God's sakes. Just checking in. This man is beyond rehabilitation. He needs to be watched very, very carefully. You have children here.
I know everything I need to know. You have a nice day.
That's the main driving force in all outlaw stories. The outlaw wants redemption, and the lawman knows better than to give it. The two bicker and fight back and forth until, ultimately, one of them is shown to be right and the other wrong. And here's where it gets interesting, because the lawman's job in these films is to remind the audience how dangerous the outlaw is, to insist that there's no redemption possible. On the rare case when the outlaw does show themselves to be redeemable, like happened in Les Miserables when Jean Valjean risks his freedom to save the lawman's life, even though that means he'll almost certainly be returned to prison by the lawman he just saved. In stories like that, the audience is treated to the lawman taking his own life to avoid his official duty. Instead of recognizing the outlaw's successful redemption and going to bat for him with the authorities, the lawman in Les Miserables, and in all outlaw stories where the outlaw finds redemption, they simply can't go on living in a world where outlaws sometimes find that redemption. And this theme is a lot more common than you think. The suicide scene at the end of Shawshank when the warden realizes Andy's done him in. The warden in Alcatraz who insists the escapees drown despite finding evidence of their successful escape on the beach. The mysterious company in Prison Break that works behind the scenes to ensure the story's outlaws are not allowed to escape. The guard who shoots Cool Hand Luke when he tries to escape. These are all repackaged, barely rewritten stories that show up every time an outlaw story's told. So we got outlaws trying to find redemption, and we've got lawmen who refuse to allow them to have that redemption. These tensions don't always play out the same, but they're always the same tensions. When Miklo gives up on redemption in Blood In, Blood Out, the audience can spot the pressures that drove him to do so. A relentless lawman in a prison that left him with few options aside from becoming a victimizer himself. In Sling Blade, the outlaw gives up redemption and directs his murderous impulses towards what viewers see as acceptable targets. In his case, a man who lives nearby and who's been abusing his family and appears to be unstoppable any other way. Childers kills him and winds up back in prison, a move that both earns his redemption from the audience and ensures at the same time that he can never really have it. Other shows have used the same trick to keep us on the outlaw's team even as he starts killing, shows like Dexter or Barry. This is yet another odd reflection of US culture, where we both want the murder and mayhem in our films, but we also want to feel like those doing the murdering aren't complete monsters. When the bad guys kill worse bad guys, we feel just a bit more forgiving. At least they didn't turn their murderous impulses on the innocent. So you've got outlaws and you've got lawmen. But we haven't yet talked about the prisons that show up in these films. Just like with the repackaged and rewritten characters of the outlaw and the lawman, the prisons shown on screen also fit a pattern that appears so often we ought to recognize it right away every time we see it. Prisons on screen are the playing field for the tensions between the outlaw and the lawman. And to make that work, producers stick to 3 main types of prison settings: prison as a playground, prison as penance, or prison as a paradox. These tropes are often used together, or sometimes producers stick to just one portrayal to really drive the depiction home. Let's take them one at a time. Prison as a playground is the most common representation repackaged over and over by movie producers. In Prison as a Playground, anything goes, and incarceration is hardly a bother to some who wind up in prison. The most common scenes of Prison as a Playground, the ones you've probably seen dozens of times in different films, is the bus full of new arrivals pulling up to the prison gate. During these odd scenes, everyone in the prison yard marches to the fence surrounding the arrivals and begins to catcall and mock the new guys as they're unloaded. Here's what that scene sounded like in The Shawshank Redemption, which might be the most popular prison film of all time. Listen closely to how producer Frank Darabont managed to paint the characters in prison as monsters who are mainly interested in victimizing one another. Here's the same scene in Blood In, Blood Out.
Hey, baby, it's no time to send us to West Texas ballroom, bitch. How about you being my old lady? Say you black, baby. This bull been crowded up for a long time. I got what you need. Put that punk in the cell with me. Allez, blue eye. Mamacita, look over here. I got something for you.
You'll drop your drawers, and you'll be home. Welcome to San Quentin.
Even in films when producers try to avoid repackaging the same scene, they still play on the same emotions and feelings of victimization. Here's audio from Orange Is the New Black, shortly after Piper's booked into prison, and another white woman is showing her around. As the tour ends, the white girl hands Piper, who is also white, a toothbrush and some other gear, and then she says,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
Oh, no, it's no problem. We look out for our own.
Our own?
Oh, don't get all PC on me. It's tribal, not racist. I'll see you around.
Now, prison as a playground goes a lot further than making fun of new arrivals to get a rise out of them. In fact, it's usually the entire prison population that's shown to be a playground, not just the process of new arrivals showing up. Prison as a playground plays out when shanks are easy to come by, when drugs are everywhere, when incarcerated people run the prison, sexual assault and violence go unpunished or even celebrated, and when the worst victimizers in the prison are also the most popular people in the prison. Here's one representative scene from Prison Break. In this scene, we meet a man named Teabag who would have an especially difficult time in a real prison based on his crimes alone, but who producers chose to show in an entirely different light in the fictional setting of a Hollywood prison.
Wrong piece of real estate, Fish. Belongs to Teabag.
Who?
You best speak with respect, Fish. Man kidnapped half a dozen boys and girls down in Bama. Raped them, killed them. Wasn't always in that order either.
Does Teabag have a real name?
That is my real name.
Teabag is the victimizer of victimizers, both in the free world and in prison. But instead of being punished by those in charge, or avoided by those on the inside, he's embraced as a white supremacist, child-murdering monster whose bad behavior actually earns him the respect of those around him. Of course, those who have seen The Shawshank Redemption know this character is actually repackaged from The Sisters, a group of men who sexually assault people at will without any punishment throughout the entire film. They're only stopped when their assaults threaten the warden's revenue stream. No one cares what they do so long as they don't impact the lawman's ability to make money. Producers love prison as a playground stories because they keep viewers tuned in with violence, scandal, sexual deviance, and manipulation. And all from the safety of a prison where we know those awful bad guys can't get us. And here I'll tip my hand a bit on the real point of this book. These prison scenes don't just stay on screen. They bleed into our hearts and minds, and they come to stand in for actual prisons in our imaginations. When someone asks us what prison is like, we all tend to resort to those representations and describe it like we've seen it. Since most of us haven't been to prison, those films are all we've got. And incredibly, Dr. Bill Yousman has found that even those of us who have been to prison still resort to movie scenes to explain our experience to others, even when those scenes don't actually align with what we've experienced. In other words, these Hollywood prison settings have the strange power to replace our real stories with hyperviolent fictions wherein those in prison are some of the most vicious and dangerous people we can imagine. And of course, here's the real point. We don't want people like that living next door to us. We want them in prison, Because where else could we possibly want to keep someone who sexually assaults others for fun without hesitation? Where else can we keep the drug dealers, murderers, and predators who pack our prison films than in a contained, secure cage? When we watch prison films and TV shows, we actually come to support the prison industrial complex based on the characters we see and the awful things they do. And it's even worse than that, because we not only want to keep prisoners locked up based on the faulty logic that they act like the actors portraying them, but we actually want prisons to become even harsher than they are right now. We see people getting away with murder, literally, and we can't help but think, what the hell? This is supposed to be prison. Why don't they clamp down and enforce the damn rules? So that's prison as a playground, as a place where anyone who manages to figure out the rules and norms of the penitentiary can basically manipulate the system and do whatever they want. In Goodfellas, it's steak and lobster, cigars and champagne.
You know, when you think of prison, you get pictures in your mind of all those old movies with rows and rows of guys behind bars. But it wasn't like that for Wise Guys. It really wasn't that bad, except that I missed Jimmy. He was doing his time in Atlanta.
Give me 2 steaks while you're in there, all right, John? Sure enough, she goes in a...
I mean, everybody else in the joint was doing real time, all mixed together, living like pigs. But we lived alone. I mean, we owned the joint.
In Let's Go to Prison, it's toilet wine and human trafficking. In Prison Break, it's the main character's ability to literally move about the prison at will using secret tunnels and hidden blueprints. He actually tattooed the blueprints on his body before arrest, and the administrators failed to notice because in playground narratives, officers are either complicit or ignorant. As we move from prison as a playground into depictions of prison as a paradox, let's go back to those new arrival scenes for just a second. The ones where everyone inside bangs on the fence and yells threats at the new guys, who they often call fresh fish. That term goes back hundreds of years, and it's shorthand for fish out of water, as in the new guys don't really fit in yet or understand how things work. Now in prison cinema, this opens a window for the monsters dreamed up by Hollywood producers to victimize and manipulate the new guys until they figure it out, until they graduate from fish to pro and become victimizers themselves. We watch films and television to zone out and just enjoy the show, so we can be forgiven for not asking the obvious question whenever we see behaviors inside a prison that are clearly counterproductive when it comes to rehabilitation. We've been consuming prison films for so long that it all just feels right, even though we should be asking, how is any of this supposed to make the community safer or the criminal less likely to reoffend in the future? That's the place where the victimizer's playground becomes the victim's paradox. When you take someone who's so desperate that they're committing crimes that land them in prison, and then you victimize them as a fresh fish until they graduate to the post-victim stage themselves, you're not fixing criminals, you're making criminals. Anytime we see a representation of prison as a place virtually guaranteed to make criminality worse, we're seeing a representation of prison as a paradox. When Schofield arrives at Fox River in Prison Break, he's greeted like this from another man in a cell across the hallway.
Yo, Fid, what you looking at? You look kind of pretty to be up in here, man. Fid!
Suggest you take a seat, Fish. Ain't nothing to do up in here but serve time. Ain't nobody gonna serve it for you.
When Andy Dufresne is hired to help the warden cook the books and embezzle money, we're left wondering how this could possibly rehabilitate anyone. When Miklo from Blood In, Blood Out is forced to defend himself repeatedly from sexual and physical assault on his first day inside, we can't help but see a prison that's guaranteed to increase the likelihood of additional crimes both inside and after release. What kind of prison makes people commit more crimes? Of course, like before, the paradox is usually emphasized by the bad behavior of victimizers, who themselves are usually shown to be living in prison as a playground. And like before, despite our recognition of the victim's traumatic experience, we can't help but think that prisons just aren't strict enough, and that if they would just clamp down a bit harder, maybe the monsters who continue to victimize others might be stopped. Instead of focusing on prison as a poorly designed, misincentivized system in need of updates, we wind up focusing on those inside, and we blame them for the way things work. So prison as a playground is shown in scenes where incarcerated people get away with anything and everything, and where prison is hardly a bother to those who understand the system. Prison as a paradox is shown whenever we see things in prison that are guaranteed to make criminality worse, not better. In the final trope, prison as penance, is depicted whenever someone experiences something in prison that fosters a sincere change of heart. When Derek Vineyard goes to prison for a racially motivated crime against a black man in American History X, he's gang raped by his fellow white supremacist in retaliation for befriending his black cellmate. The rape is a depiction of prison as a playground for the rapist. It's a depiction of prison as a paradox from the perspective of the audience. For how can we possibly see sexual assault as a positive tool of rehabilitation? But as the film progresses, producers twist the representation into prison as penance when Derek begins to change his ways in response not to the incarceration, but to the rape. Derek's time inside didn't change anything aside from him befriending a single black man. He wasn't rehabilitated, he didn't have a change of heart and recognize the error of his ways. But once he's raped in prison, that changes his heart. And from there, he discards his neo-Nazi lifestyle in favor of a path of redemption. Prison as Penance reveals the penitentiary and the prison industrial complex as effective, necessary tools of social protection and rehabilitation. Sure, the things incarcerated people experience while inside might be awful, even torturous, but in the end, if they work to change their hearts and minds in a way that seems impossible any other way, as viewers, we feel like maybe it's worth it. I mean, sure, assault and abuse are bad, but if the only thing that could change Derek's ways was the trauma he experienced, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. And anyway, if those monsters who are doing the raping are the sort of people who plan to keep acting that way, perhaps prison is the best place for them. And like Dexter and Barry, perhaps the victim they chose is the victim we would want them to choose. Talk about warping our morals into a pretzel. Prison as Penance twists us into endorsing things that we wouldn't dream of endorsing in any other setting. But once we're talking about the bad guys in prison, the rules seem to change, and we suddenly don't mind so much if they're abused, especially if it initiates a change of heart. Prison as Penance is evident anytime a character's arrest and incarceration work to update their morals and change their ways. In Blood In, Blood Out, Miklow's friend Paco, played by Benjamin Bratt, is arrested alongside Miklow. But they part ways when the arrest that eventually leads to Miklow giving up on redemption actually initiates a change of heart in Paco that causes him to become a cop. They split from their mutual life of criminality, and one becomes the outlaw and the other the lawman. In I Love You, Philip Morris, we learn that despite escaping numerous times and earning extended sentences with each recapture, the main character has changed his ways and decided to stop escaping. Apparently, prison changed him. In Conviction, it's Carl Upchurch's incarceration that leads to his change of heart. He eventually holds a gang peace summit in Kansas City that earns him his redemption in the eyes of the audience. In The Shawshank Redemption, it's Red's seemingly endless incarceration, which eventually leads him to tell the parole board, "Frankly, Sonny, I just don't give a damn." Then he's released, as if the point of prison is to wear down those who go there so much that they eventually just give up on redemption. Then, and only then, are they released. All three of these tropes, playground, penance, and paradox, they all work to make viewers feel like prisons are necessary institutions of social safety, the only thing standing between the monsters on our screen and our children. And worse, we actually want prisons to become harsher, more difficult, more locked down when we watch these narratives. We can't help but respond to the bad behavior of those inside with disgust at both their desires and at the prison which allows them to keep doing awful things. And even in the rare case when representations of prison as a paradox cause us to wonder, how could any of this possibly rehabilitate someone, we still come away feeling like those inside are far too dangerous and evil to ever again be let loose upon society. I mean, sure, I might not mind if Andy Dufresne or Red from The Shawshank Redemption move in next door to me, but the majority of those in any prison film are depicted as beyond redemption. We can't help but see prison as the best place for them. It goes without saying, but prisons on TV are not like prisons in real life. Are there bad guys in prison? Sure. Pick a group of 1,000 people at random, in prison or on the streets, and you'll find a few assholes who refuse to follow the rules. But we all know how those people come to behave the way they behave. They were raised in a world where they learned that behavior, or they experienced something along the way that incentivized them to keep acting that way. But the majority of people in prison are just victims of bad genes, bad upbringing, bad education, bad traumas, bad mistakes. And most of us are just trying to do our time and get the hell out of there. Until we update our spectacles of punishment, we'll find ourselves supporting a permanently expanding and forever harshening prison system that does much more harm than good. And we won't be able to explain why we feel the way we feel without forcing ourselves to remember the non-stop barrage of prison films that have made us feel this way. Until Hollywood starts offering more realistic representations of prison and those of us who wind up there, our culture will continue to take what they give us and form our opinions based on those characters and settings. And until we update the way we feel about prisons and those who wind up there, Hollywood will likely keep feeding us the same old repackaged narratives of mayhem and murder. The only way to update the system is to demand a new and improved product. Prisons are boring. Mumia Abu-Jamal once described life in prison as, quote, oscillating between the banal and the bizarre. But who wants to watch 12 hours of someone staring at the wall, followed by 5 minutes of walking the yard, 20 minutes of lunch in the chow hall, and then back to staring at the wall? We prefer the spectacle of bad behavior, and when a film is set inside prison, we want that spectacle cranked all the way up to level 10. We want the real monsters. To replace that level of spectacle, we have to rethink what prisons are, and we have to find a way to make stories that people want to watch, but that don't include over-the-top tales of victimization and trauma. And we can do that through other methods of redemption, mainly education and restoration. It won't happen overnight, but we can slowly begin to realign our prison narratives with more positive images of self-creation and growth. And we can do it while preserving the spectacle, because prisons kind of feel like magical spaces ripe for exploration, even when the rape and murder are minimized or eliminated. I teach inside prisons across the state of Colorado, and every time I enter one of these spaces, I see something else worth exploring. Handprints and messages carved into inmate-built walls, tunnels running beneath the walls of Colorado's original state penitentiary, students who publish books from inside prison without the aid of computers or the internet, graduate degrees earned from solitary confinement, the courage required to sit in a restorative justice session and look a victim in the eye during a sincere apology. There are plenty of ways to make engaging prison cinema without appealing to the worst of our human nature. All we have to do is start buying those films and tuning into those podcasts. A great place to start is the award-winning podcast Ear Hustle, born inside San Quentin Prison, or my friends who host the DU Prison Arts Initiative's podcast Within, which is recorded inside Colorado prisons. That podcast is actually produced by Dr. Ashley Hamilton, who I had on the podcast a few weeks ago. So check those podcasts out, check out the book if you're into that sort of thing, and love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
Most of these cons don't click. They're just filling space, doing time. It's the gangs that run this place. See a black dude with a comb over there? That's Bonafide. He runs the BGA, the Black Guerrilla Army. Those polar bears over in the corner, that's Aryan Vanguard, the AVers. Those white boys control the dope trade, do freelance killings, anything for the right price.
Well, maybe you'd like to swap for some of that tender white meat. You can pay your bets with that.